Evolving from the manufacturing norms of the globalized world to the new norms of a deglobalized one will not be like disassembling a car and then reassembling it in a new location. It will be like disassembling a car and then reassembling it as a bread maker, an apple picker, and a Barbie dream jet. The processes we use to manufacture things will change because the environment will change. Many of the technologies we use to manufacture goods under globalization will not prove applicable to the fractured world emerging. That means that we, today in 2022, have a lot of industrial plant that just won't be relevant much longer. Consider China. Total manufacturing value add in China in 2021 was right around $4 trillion US, some 3/4 of which were for export. The raw value of the underlying industrial plant is easily 10 times that, not counting supporting transport and power infrastructure, nor the thousands of long-range ships that shuttle inputs into and end products out of the country, nor the value of supporting codependent supply systems that involve other countries throughout East Asia. It is all going to become stranded. Deglobalization, whether triggered by the American withdrawal or demographic collapse, will break the supply links that make most China-centric manufacturing possible, even before consuming nations more jealously protect their home markets. Pretty much the entire export-driven industrial plant, and the not small portion of the domestically driven industrial plant, will be written off. Not all of it will need to be replaced. Demographic decline means global consumption peaked back in the golden pre-COVID days of 2019, while the fracturing of the global system will further reduce overall global income and wealth levels. But within many of those smaller fragments, there will be a need to build replacement industrial plant. After all, tapping the global market for finished goods will no longer be a viable option. The characteristics of this new industrial plant will reflect a fundamentally different macroeconomic, strategic, financial, and technological environment. It will be a bit different based on where that plant is located, but some common characteristics will exist across all of them. 1. Mass production assembly lines are largely out. Mass production of any type requires massive economies of scale. Even within the North American market, such production only needs to serve about 500 million people with a combined economy of about $25 trillion. Yes, that's a lot, but it's but 1/3 of the pre-COVID global total, and the NAFTA countries will be producing primarily for themselves, not for the world writ large. 2. Reducing economies of scale reduces the opportunities for automation. Applying new technology to any manufacturing system adds cost, and automation is no exception. It will still happen, but only in targeted applications such as textiles and advanced semiconductors. Such automated applications are already cheaper than human labor. 3. The pace of technological improvement in manufacturing will slow. Let me make that broader. The pace of all technological improvement will slow. Rapid tech advancement requires a large body of highly skilled workers, the opportunities for large-scale collaboration among those workers, and a metric butt-ton of capital to pay for the development, operationalization, and application of new ideas. Demographic collapse is gutting the first. Deglobalization is fracturing the second, and the combined pair are ending the third. 4. Supply chains will be much shorter. In a disconnected world, any point of exposure is a failure point, and any manufacturing system that cannot snuff out its own complexity is one that will not survive. The model of dozens of geographically isolated suppliers feeding into a single sprawling supply chain will vanish. Instead, successful manufacturing will twist into two new, mutually supportive shapes. The first will carry out more steps within individual locations in order to eliminate as much supply chain risk as possible. This suggests that such core facilities will become far larger. The second sort of manufacturing will be tiny facilities that supply customized parts. Machine shops in particular should thrive. They can quickly absorb capital and technology and new designs and new workers and crank out customized or rapidly changing parts for use in those larger core facilities. 5. Production will become co-located with consumption. With the global map fracturing, serving a consumer market means producing goods within that market. For smaller and more isolated markets, this suggests extreme production costs due to an utter lack of economies of scale, as well as difficulty sourcing the necessary range of input materials. Larger systems, NAFTA comes to mind, will do much better. After all, inputs sourced in Utah can be used to build a product in Toronto that can be sold in the Yucatan. Co-location is relative. 6. The new systems will put premiums on simplicity and security, just as the old system put premiums on cost and efficiency. The death of just-in-time will force manufacturers to do one of two things. Option A is to warehouse masses of product, including finished product, as far forward in the manufacturing process as possible, preferably on the very edge of major population centers. Option B is to abandon as much of the traditional manufacturing process as possible and do all-in manufacturing as physically close to the end consumer as possible. One technology suited to the latter is additive or 3D manufacturing. The idea being that a powdered or liquefied material is sprayed in thin layers over and over again until a product is printed. Yes, additive manufacturing is expensive in per-product absolute terms, but the goalposts have moved. Cost is no longer the driving focus, and any 3D printed products by definition will have next to zero warehousing costs. 7. The workforce will be very different. Between an alternating emphasis on customization and carrying out multiple manufacturing steps in one location, there isn't much room for people who don't know what they are doing. One of the great gains of the industrial age was that low-skilled labor could make a reasonable living working on an assembly line. But now, demand for the lowest-skilled jobs within the manufacturing space will evaporate, while rewards for the highest-skilled jobs will soar. For poor countries, this will be a disaster. Moving up the value-add scale means starting at the bottom. Between geopolitical devolutions, demographic inversions, and technical changes, most of those jobs will no longer exist. In addition, shorter, simpler supply chains will reduce overall employment in manufacturing in general, as measured in terms of jobs per unit of product produced. The end result? Widening inequality both within and among countries. 8. Not everyone can play. Each fractured piece of the world will need to look to its own internal manufacturing system, and many will lack the capacity. The capital requirements for building out industrial plant are steep. Demographic aging will limit options within Europe. Likely restrictions on capital transfers will limit options throughout the non-East Asian developing world. The regions that can best tap outside capital will be those with the best prospects for tapping resources, producing products reliably, and maybe even selling a few out of region. Southeast Asia, India, and the greater Buenos Aires region. The only region likely to be able to fully self-fund its own build-out is NAFTA. Finally, and most depressingly, there are different sorts of losers in this world we are devolving into. It is one thing if your country loses a manufacturing system because someone else has a better geography of success for making this or that widget in the age unfolding. Change the map of transport, or finance, or energy, or industrial materials, and the list of winners or losers will shift with it. That's not a happy outcome for the loser, but it isn't the end of the world. Unless it is. There is a difference, a big difference, between a rising price of access and an absolute lack of access. The first leads to an industrial hollowing out. The second leads to outright deindustrialization. Just as with energy, countries that lose access to the building blocks of modern industrial society do not just enter recession, they lose the capacity to play the game at all. Now let's talk products. There are literally hundreds of subsectors across the manufacturing space, comprising thousands of intermediate and end products each. Just a list of them would slay more trees than this entire book. We are going to focus on the top 11 in terms of internationally traded value. The single biggest piece of international manufacturers' trade is automotive. All those 30,000 parts per vehicle have their own supply chains. Since each part has its own labor requirements and cost structure, a lot of countries produce a lot of steps and often serve as suppliers to one another's brands and markets. It's pretty standard to find a German transmission in a Ford, or a Mexican engine block in a Geely, or Malaysian wiring in a BMW. Of course, that level of industrial interplay is totally going away. This isn't quite as disastrous as it sounds. Because everyone builds a bit of everything, any place where existing supply chain systems are concentrated generates significant network effects, assuming there is sufficient consumer demand for the end product. In China, where vehicle sales peaked in 2018, this is bad. In Europe, where it peaked decades ago, this is worse. But the Texas-Mexico axis is kind of perfect. When 25,000 of the parts are already produced or assembled within a fairly tight geography that is within the world's largest car market, the economics of adding each individual remaining part are not particularly daunting. Heavy vehicle manufacturing, primarily farm, mining, and construction equipment, in many ways follows the same pattern as automotive. Lots of countries produce lots of different pieces and flip their intermediate inputs back and forth. Parts is parts is parts, but only to a point. Where billions of people want a car, not everyone feels the need to rush out and pick up the latest and greatest backhoe. There's also the far from minor point that you cannot finagle something the size of a combine into a standard container unit. Shipping difficulties alone mean that most locations that need farming or mining or construction equipment need to manufacture a lot of it themselves. Taken together, heavy equipment is a bit like automotive in microcosm. Like automotive, heavy equipment manufacturing exists in the three big manufacturing hubs, East Asia, Europe, and North America, each of which both largely serves its own regional markets, but also provides upwards of 1/5 of components for one another's systems. Secondary powers, think Argentina, Brazil, and Russia, have managed to preserve their own heavy equipment manufacturing systems due to a mix of tariff barriers and necessity. Moving forward, the German system will be absolutely hosed. Germany's demographics are too terminal to maintain production. It is too integrated with other terminally demographic countries to maintain its supply chains. It is too hooked upon industrial commodities imports to even attempt large-scale manufacturing, and it is too dependent upon extracontinental exports to maintain revenue flows. Night and day different is Brazil. Easier energy and materials access, a largely homegrown industry that builds from the wheels up with minimal exposure to any other country's issues. Add in a hefty need domestically for construction and agricultural and mining equipment, and Brazil might see an expansion in sales abroad as other countries fall out of the industry. Sitting in between the Germans and Brazilians as regard to supply chain sanctity, domestic demand, the security of materials access, and demographic structures are the Italians, French, and Japanese. Italy's output tends towards smaller models for national reasons. Smaller farm fields and congested cities require smaller equipment, which coincidentally are easier to export. France's system has captured nearly all domestic sales, but remains heavily export-geared. The French and Japanese models will have their wings clipped if they cannot maintain excellent relations with the Americans, the most popular end destination for both. The challenge is less about need and more about access. China faces a similar, if less intense, version of the same problem. Internal demand in China is far higher than in France or Japan. Still, there's a big difference between having 80% of a mining truck and having the whole thing. Luckily, anyone who is pretty good at automotive should be able to prove pretty good at heavy equipment. Many of the same skill sets and infrastructure requirements apply. Within North America, look to the Texas-Mexico axis for mining and construction gear, and Houston in particular. Want farm equipment? It'll still be the Midwest you're after. The lumber industry, that's timber if you're British, straddles the world of agriculture and manufacturing in complex and shifting ways. The value-add process from tree to lumber to pulp, or boards, or aromatics, or planks, adds up to a cool $250 billion of goods. And even that is before the real work begins that transforms the wood into furniture, or veneer, or cologne, or house guts, or charcoal. As you might guess, mapping the lumber industry's future, hell, mapping the lumber industry's present, is a snarly process. So let's focus on the obvious bits. Everyone uses everything. In different concentrations, of course, but everyone uses wood for construction and furniture and fuel and paper and so on. Wood is a base material for human existence, and it has been so long as there have been humans. But not everyone can produce wood in volume. The United States, as a large temperate zone country with extensive forested mid and high altitudes, is by far the world's largest wood producer. But because of its penchant for large single-family homes packed with furniture, it is also a net importer. Canada and Mexico fill nearly all of America's surplus needs. Forget needing to worry about the changes a post-globalized world will bring to North America. The continent is already looking after its own for this subsector. In a deglobalized world, the industry's problems are threefold. First, the United States is the source for the more important of globally traded manufactured wood products like agglomerates such as pellets, sawdust, and particle board, panels like plywood and pulp for paper. In a fractured world, such high volume to low value products just are not going to sail as far. That will be an issue for the forest managers and processors in the American Piedmont, but will largely pass unnoticed throughout the rest of North America. For consumers throughout Europe and Asia, dizzying product price inflation is pretty much a given, especially since nearly all reasonable product substitutes are petroleum-based. Second, what doesn't come from the United States tends to cross those geopolitical stress points I keep yammering on about. Wood from heavily forested Southeast Asia goes to Northeast Asia. Wood from Russia goes to Central and Western Europe. The variety of disruptions in the wood trade to come will be as varied as the product mixes. About the only flow that will probably be okay, will be Scandinavian wood going elsewhere in Europe. Third, there is a big, looming environmental issue. In 2019, wood and various wood byproducts accounted for 2.3% of Europe's electricity generation, mostly because the EU has some epically stupid regulations that consider the burning of wood and wood byproducts to be carbon neutral, despite the pretty much undisputed fact that wood burning emits more carbon dioxide than even coal. More to the point, some half of the trees felled are used as direct fuel, with the vast majority being burned within a day's walk of the forest's edge, particularly in India and sub-Saharan Africa. In a post-globalized world, very little about wood as fuel is going to be inhibited. If anything, the opposite will happen. If people cannot source globally traded energy products like natural gas or diesel, they will have a choice between not having heat for cooking or staying warm, or burning wood. The scale of the devastation in terms of carbon emissions, land cover, biodiversity, smog, water quality, and safety caused by half the world's population reverting to wood burning is difficult to wrap the mind around. Next up, with the fall of Asia Inc., expect the world of semiconductors to look very different. The fabrication of semiconductors is an exceedingly difficult, expensive, exacting, and above all, concentrated process. Everything from the melting of the silicon dioxide powder, to the drawing of the liquid silicon into crystals, to the slicing of those crystals into wafers, to the etching, doping, and baking of those wafers, to the breaking of those wafers into individual semiconducting bits, to the assembling and packaging of those incredibly delicate bits into protective frames that can be slapped into Game Boys and smart light bulbs and laptops, is typically all done at the same facility. Each step requires clean room conditions, so rather than ship product multiple times via clean chain transport, it is safer and more reliable to do it all in the same place. Taiwan, Japan, and Korea do the really good semiconductors. Malaysia and Thailand handle the mid-market. China has the bargain basement. These facilities just don't move. Or at least, they haven't. But the world is changing, and now they are moving. Constrained as they are by the need for very highly skilled workers, rock-solid electricity reliability, and a host of at-scale manufacturing support systems, most fab facilities will have little choice but to come to the United States. This highlights a problem. American manufacturing, especially in the information technology space, is exceedingly high value add. It can and does participate in the mass manufacturing of high-end chips that are used in servers, laptops, and smartphones. So much so that even at the height of hollowed-out globalization, the United States remains responsible for roughly half of all chips by value, despite producing only about 1/9 of chips by number. Unfortunately, the future of manufacturing will still need lots of non-genius level chips. American workers can only stoop to that level with significant subsidization. Nor can Mexico help. It lacks the culture of large-scale precision education required to generate the necessary workforce. If the goal is to manufacture something that can only become digitized in recent decades, this is a mammoth problem. You can say goodbye to the Internet of Things. Although, honestly, do we really need a digital thermometer that sends its results to your phone or a clothes dryer that sings? And we should probably prepare for a generation of vehicles that are more analog than digital. Of course, there is more to semiconductors than just semiconductors. By themselves, chips are useless. They must be incorporated into wiring harnesses and control boards and whatnot before being installed into other products. That intermediate stage requires eyes and fingers. This not only makes me think about future partnerships with Mexico and Colombia for intermediate manufacturing steps, but also suggests grand partnerships are on deck throughout the industries built around semiconductors in general, specifically computing, smartphones, and consumer electronics. Computer assembly is surprisingly straightforward. Most of the important components are in fact semiconductors, and it really just comes down to a question of price point. If it is a lower quality product and it can be done by hand, like say assembling motherboards, Mexico will be where it's at. If more precision is required, say the installation of displays, and so automation is required, look to America. The first post-globalization decade is going to be rough for smartphone users. Right now, nearly the entire supply chain is either in Europe or Asia. The European system is probably fine. Most European cell manufacturers are in Scandinavia, and their regional supply chains are unlikely to face too many challenges. But the Asian system? Korea is the biggest player, and Korea's ongoing existence, not only as a manufacturing or tech power, but as a functional country, is dependent upon the Koreans making their peace with the Japanese. A significant wrong step and the entire Android operating system will lose most of its hardware. As for the Apple ecosystem, Apple designs its products in California, but then entirely outsources its production to a China-centric network that is certain to implode in the not-too-distant future. That entire manufacturing system will need to be remade from scratch within the United States. Southeast Asian states lack the required scale, while Mexico lacks the precision capabilities. Even in the best-case scenario, once the world cracks, we will go years between iPhone models. Electronics, a very broad category that includes everything from white goods to fax machines to routers to blenders to hairdryers, are a bit like automotive in that everyone has their fingers in everything. Unlike automotive, however, there isn't much of a secret sauce. No one carries out corporate espionage or threatens war over the IP required to make a ceiling fan in a garage door. What defines the electronic space is that all-important feature of order-era manufacturing, labor differentiation. The skill set, and above all price point, that makes the casing for an office phone is different from the skill set that wires the cord or builds out the digital interface. The successful electronics manufacturers of the future will be the ones who have multiple labor skill sets and price points within close proximity. Look to both Southeast Asia and the US-Mexican border region. Even more than the other sectors, electronics are a big deal. Far more than automotive or computers, electronics are a huge product category and are among the most labor-intensive of the manufacturing sectors. It may sound sexy to build semiconductors domestically, but if you want to employ a couple million people, it's electronics you're after. Another big-ticket subsector is aerospace. As with automotive, the big three order-era manufacturing regions each has its own system. Boeing for North America, Airbus for Europe, and Comac for China. This won't last. Comac, despite decades of forced tech transfers and espionage, has proven unable to build all the required components for a functioning jet. Post-order, it simply won't have the capacity to import what it needs, and it will simply die. Airbus isn't much better. Airbus is a multi-state conglomerate of aerospace firms from Spain, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is responsible for little things like wings and engines. In a post-Brexit world, the future of Airbus was already sketchy. Fast forward to the aftermath of the pending US-British trade deal, and British aerospace will be folded into the Boeing family. Even worse, some of the biggest purchasers of Airbus aircraft have been the Persian Gulf long-haul carriers of Etihad, Emirates, and Qatar Air. All their flights originate or terminate in the Persian Gulf. With the Americans abandoning the Persian Gulf region to its own fate, there is no way in hell that civilian aviation will continue to operate in the area. If Airbus has a future, it will be in reinventing itself as a military supplier for a Europe that can no longer rely upon American strategic overwatch. In the aftermath, Boeing will take over global aviation. The global aviation market will be much smaller, but there's something to be said for being the last man standing. Machinery is where things get sketchy, and not simply because no one really puts machinery into a specific category for data collection. Germany is hands down the world's best, because the German cultural penchant for anal retentive precision is precisely what makes for good machinery. Unfortunately for the world, culture cannot be transferred, no matter how much cash is splurged on it. Just ask the Chinese, whose efforts to pirate German designs and mimic German output have consistently met with failure. This leads us to three outcomes. First, the United States will be okay, mostly. While Americans aren't as good at this sort of thing as Germans, Houstonians come reasonably close. Second, the Chinese industrial position is utterly screwed. Even if nothing else goes wrong, the Chinese are utterly dependent upon German machinery to maintain their entire industrial behemoth. Third, the world writ large will experience a technological slowdown. Without the Germans doggedly pushing the envelope for what good machinery looks like, expect technical advancement in the space, which is required to manufacture everything else, to stall. That's the high end. A complete reorganization on the low end is imminent as well. The two subsectors that will see the biggest shifts are textiles and wiring. Textiles is a low-skilled, labor-intensive industry, while wiring is low-skilled and electricity-intensive. Since the dawn of the industrial age, these sectors have been go-tos for newly industrializing countries trying to get their foot in the door. No more. Advances in automation now mean that most yarn, thread, cloth, and clothes can be made via machine in a developed country more cheaply than by semi-skilled human hands in Bangladesh. Expect cloth and clothing made from natural fibers to relocate to where the wool and cotton are harvested. In particular, look to the American South, Australia, and New Zealand. For synthetic fibers, it will be difficult to top the U.S. Gulf Coast. Keep in mind that these jobs will look very different upon their return compared to their departure in the 1980s and 1990s. A single systems engineer can maintain an acre-sized textile facility all by his or her lonesome. As to wiring, The U.S. shale revolution has granted the United States the cheapest electricity in the world. Not only is metal smelting coming back to the United States, so too is the next step in the process: wiring. Human hands will still be needed for finishing work in textiles and the fabrication of wiring harnesses for follow-on manufacturing, but what used to be a foot-in-the-door industry has irrevocably changed. There's more at stake here than just a few stray socks. Textiles and footwear and wiring are typically among the earliest steps in the development process. Poorer countries use these subsectors not simply to gain income and begin urbanization, but also to build the sort of organizational and training experience to move up the value-added chain into more sophisticated manufacturing and systems. The relocation of these subsectors to more advanced economies in general, and their increasing automation in specific, denies countries that have not yet begun the development process the opportunity to access what has typically proven to be the bottom rung of the process. Whether the country in question is Bolivia, or Laos, or Congo, the risk is not of devolving to a world that predates 1939, but to one that predates 1800. Anything that raises the marginal cost of transport increases friction throughout the system. Simply a 1% increase in the cost of a subsidiary part largely obliterates the economics of an existing supply chain. Most locations will count themselves fortunate if their transport costs increase by only 100%. This is the world we're moving into. Changes in transport, finance, energy, and access to industrial inputs will make it poorer and more fractured, and will dial back much of the progress we've come to associate with the modern era. And even that assumes everyone can continue to source their needs, and in doing so survive as modern nations at all. Unfortunately, that is not the end of the story. Now we have to discuss who will be around to see this future. Now we have to discuss who gets to engage in the one activity that supersedes all others: eating.